Rachel, we are ready to go.
All right, thank you, Carlota. Now let me start by introducing myself. I'm Rachel Cossey. I work as a Science Coordination Specialist in the Science Division. Along with coordinating the Making Peace with Nature report, I also coordinate a project on sustainable land management and contribute to the environmental statistics and SDGs team. Today we're here to present the Making Peace with Nature report, launched on 18 February by the UN Secretary General and the UNEP Executive Director. We'll hear from some of the experts involved in the report on the main findings through an interactive dialogue, followed by a Q&A session. Before that, we'll hear from our Executive Director, Inger Anderson, to provide some welcoming remarks. But first, some housekeeping notes. This is a virtual event. It's being held in Zoom and streams online on UNEP's website. And registered participants in Zoom can submit questions anytime in the chat box. And we will answer them during the Q&A session after the presentation and roundtable. We also invite colleagues following the event on YouTube to submit questions in the YouTube chat. Please indicate your name and the entity you represent. We want to know who you are. My colleague Adele Ricasso will be collecting your comments and questions to be answered during the last part of the event. The event is being recorded and can be shared widely with your network. It can be accessed in the event page, and my colleague Adele will post the link in the two chats. We are joined by UNEP and UN colleagues, member state representatives, representatives from UNEP accredited NGOs, and other partners. The event will have three parts. First, we'll hear introductory remarks by our UNEP Executive Director, and then there will be a brief dialogue between the experts, followed by a Q&A where we invite comments and questions from the audience. We'll be sharing the resources to the report and contact information for follow-up at the end of the session. Over to you, Inger.
Well, thank you, and thank you to everyone who's joining on the various channels where we're doing this, and a big thanks to this fantastic author team, part of whom that are joining us today. You will hear more from Eva Basdev, from Jyoti Gupta, and from Bob Watson, who are making up the author team. And you will hear later on from Maria Jesus, who was the primary or one of the primary authors of the GEO for Youth. So this is really great. And to you, Rachel, you've been doing, what is it, 27 of these now? So bravo to you and to the author team for doing all this outreach at all times of the day to ensure that the whole world can get an understanding of this significant and path-breaking report, Making Peace with Nature. And the report, we will hear from these eminent people, as you may recall, was launched by the Secretary General in New York at a massive press conference that took place immediately prior to UNEA 5.1. And it speaks to these three planetary crises that everyone who works with UNEP and around UNEP knows that we're talking about: the climate crisis, the biodiversity and nature crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. And it speaks to the urgency of now. But it's not just telling the science, it's also telling what the kind of gear shifts that we need to enable right now to make sure that we can get on that steady trajectory. And that will involve reaching for SDG 12 goals, sustainable consumption and production, and being much more aware of the footprint that we as humanity have on this good earth, notwithstanding that we need to lift so many people out of poverty, notwithstanding that we need the economic wheels to turn, notwithstanding that 800 million people are going to bed hungry, and we need to ensure that we end world hunger. So it is very much looking at what is it that the earth can deliver to us, and how can we treat the earth in such a way that it can do so sustainably. And it looks at that in the context of climate, where we know that we are on a trajectory, or if we do just the current policy, we are on a trajectory of 3.5 degrees by the end of the century. It looks at it in the context of biodiversity, where we know, IPBES has told us, that unless we do something well, we are set to lose about 1 million species out of the just under 8 million that we are estimating to have on this good planet. And it looks at that in the context of pollution and waste, where we know that marine plastic pollution, for example, has increased tenfold since 1980, and 400 million tons of toxic sludge go into the oceans every year. So How to do that? Well, this is what we're going to hear from these eminent authors and scientists. But there is a to-do item for governments, and the governments have to set the regulatory guardrails around this. There is a to-do item for private sector. Private sector need to lean in and cannot consider short-term profits, but need to understand the systemic shifts. But governments can set the guardrails. And there is a to-do item for you and me, the consumers and communities, because we, after all, vote with our Kenyan shillings, with our dollar bills, with our euros, with whatever money we use, in the kind of consumption patterns that we drive. So, and there is a to-do item, obviously, for intergovernmental organizations, not least UNEP, but the United Nations writ large and other intergovernmental organizations. So, without further ado, let me hand it back over to you, Rachel, so that we can hear this very interesting dialogue amongst our experts. I'm very, very grateful to everyone who is present today. Over to you.
Thank you, Inger. I would now like to introduce 4 of the over 50 experts that worked on the report and who will now present the findings through an interactive dialogue, asking each other some provocative questions. Here with us, we have Bob Watson, who co-led the report. He's chaired or co-chaired numerous environmental assessments, including chair of IPCC and IPBES, served as a senior scientific advisor for the White House, World Bank, and UK DEFRA. Ivar Bast has also co-led the report and serves as the co-chair for the Future of Geo Steering Committee and is a senior scientific advisor for the Norwegian Environment Agency. Joyita Gupta was a scientific advisor for the report and is a professor of environment and development in the Global South at the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research of the University of Amsterdam and the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. Maria Jesus Irola served as a research fellow for the report and was a coordinating lead author for the UNEP Geo6 for Youth report. She is an environmental consultant at Strategic Environmental Advice, a consultancy firm that supports organizations such as GCF, World Bank, and Conservation International. We are very excited to hear from this amazing group of experts, so let's not take any more time. I'll now hand over to Joyita to begin the dialogue.
Thank you for the invitation to highlight the findings of the new UNEP report, Making Peace with Nature. We will do that in a dialogue where we challenge each other with some slightly provocative questions. So let me start by asking you, Bob. You helped initiate the work on this report, but the state of knowledge presented in this report is already well known. Why then go to all the trouble of revisiting the latest global environmental assessments?
Thank you, Joyita. As we know, in the last decade, there have probably been 25 or more major assessments looking at different aspects of the environment. They include the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the UNEP Geo report, the GBO report, the Resources report, the Chemicals Outlook report. So one of the questions is, to what degree are the findings of these different reports consistent? And how consistent are the proposed actions of these different reports? So the idea was to really bring together a full synthesis of these 25 reports. We also used a few other new pieces of research, especially as the COVID-19 pandemic hit while we were actually putting our document together. So overall, about 50 leading experts helped to prepare and guide this particular synthesis. And of course, it is based on the work of thousands and thousands of thousands or so. So the key question was, how could we synthesize all of this together and get a more holistic view of environment and development? There is actually no question. The reports are fully consistent, and indeed, the recommendations, or should I say, the options for action, are consistent with each other. What we've learned from this report, which indeed we did already unfortunately know, is since the Stockholm conference over 50 years ago, the number of environmental issues has grown and the severity has grown. So we clearly know we have a planetary emergency. There is no question that's evidence-based. Let me now, however, turn to even challenging. The report indicates that humanity has formally declared war on nature. How can we get such a depressing message across in a way that encourages action? Humanity prosperity has on average doubled in the last 50 years, and we've solved many of the development challenges. We've achieved hard-won development gains, and that is due in large part to the way we have transformed nature. Many people see these improvements and wonder, what could possibly be wrong with our current economic model? Eva?
Well, Bob, yes, you're absolutely right. We have, on average, prosperity has doubled. But let me turn to the infographic, which is on the screen now, which is from the report, and which puts that gain into some perspective. If we look at the left-hand pink side of the infographic, we see that over the last 50 years, trade has grown tenfold, global economy has grown nearly fivefold, and the world population has doubled. Yes, this means that on average, prosperity has also doubled, but about 1.3 billion people remain poor and some 700 million are hungry. And these numbers we know have increased also during the pandemic. So the infographic sums up the scale of the human impact on the planet. And we will go into that a bit more into detail soon. But I'd like to stress one point, though, and that is that the rising gross domestic product, GDP, overstates human progress because it does not account for declines in natural capital. And natural capital is at least sort of estimated to be 20% of planetary wealth. If we on the other hand, used a measure like inclusive wealth, which also accounts for natural, human, and social capital, that would be a much better measure of sustainable prosperity. One figure is a study looked at a period of 25 years, the growth rate of natural wealth for a large set of, or inclusive wealth, actually, for a large set of countries showed the progress, which was nearly half of that of GDP. So really, growth and prosperity measured in GDP actually overstates the progress. So basically, the baseline is that today's increasingly unequal and resource-intensive development model degrades and surpasses the Earth's finite capacity to sustain well-being. We must restore this capacity and adapt to it, as indicated in this infographic. But we will go a bit more into how in detail later, but this is really why the Secretary General rightfully has called on the world to end the senseless and suicidal war and make peace with nature. But let me underline that it can be done without surrendering hard-won development gains, while also honoring the rightful aspirations of poorer nations and people to enjoy better living standards. But that means transforming human relation with nature, and the challenge is really systemic, and the coming decade is also really crucial. So if I might then turn to back to Joita and sort of ask the questions that, well, most of us feel rather insignificant in comparison with the vast Earth. And so how do we communicate that the level of human greenhouse gas emissions, land use, resource extraction, and pollution is really of such significance?
Well, Ivar, let me show you a few slides that illustrate the scale of human impact on the world. First of all, if you look at this particular slide, you see that the Earth is no longer vast in itself because humans are now dominating the Earth, as shown here. If you look at the combined biomass of mammals on Earth, then the human population constitutes about a third, and livestock nearly 2/3, while wild animals now amount to less than 5%. If you move to the next slide, what we can see is that human development is largely fueled by a tripling in the extraction of natural resources and energy over the past 50 years. The economy has grown more, and some of that is due to the increased efficiency. But we are far from decoupling the economy from environmental degradation. This figure shows you the growth in global primary energy consumption is largely attributed to the growth in fossil fuels, such as coal, shown in black, oil in purple, and gas, shown in blue. About 2/3 of the warming caused by greenhouse gases is due to carbon dioxide, mostly originating from the use of fossil fuels. Bioenergy consumption is at the level of pre-industrial times. Above fossil fuels are hydropower in blue and nuclear power in pink, and the thin green line is other renewables. This figure illustrates the scale of human dependence on fossil fuels, and it serves to illustrate why halting global warming is such a tall order. Emissions of heat-trapping greenhouse gases are still increasing, with current atmospheric concentrations much higher than at any time in the last 800,000 years. Natural sinks today are only able to absorb around half of the anthropogenic carbon emissions split between terrestrial ecosystems and the ocean. If we move to the next slide, we can see that 3/4 of the land and 2/3 of the ocean are now impacted by humans. 1/4 of global warming results from activities related to land use. This figure shows global use of ice-free land and is adapted from the IPCC. Moreover, 1/4 of land has been radically transformed, and the remaining near natural land is projected to be only 10% by 2050. If we move now to the next slide, we will see that the need to address pollution and waste is a key motivation, or was a key motivation, of the Stockholm Conference of 1972, and I think it will be a key issue at the Stockholm Conference next year. It is still, therefore, with us. If we look at the production and release of chemicals, we see that it is increasing as indicated in this graph, adapted from GEO6. It shows the use of nitrogen fertilizer in the blue line. Fertilizers entering coastal ecosystems have produced more than 400 dead zones, totaling an area greater than that of the UK or Ecuador. This graph also shows you pesticide use in red and the output of the chemical industry in purple. Some of these chemicals threaten human health and the environment. Marine plastics pollution has, for instance, increased tenfold since 1980. So I think we can safely conclude that human pressure on the environment is unprecedented. But let me turn back to you, Bob, and ask you, what about nature's unique capacity to absorb that pressure? How do we convince people that more action is necessary?
Thank you, Joyita. As you talked about in an earlier slide, most of our energy is indeed produced from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And as you already pointed out, the oceans and the land can only absorb about half of those increasing emissions of carbon dioxide. And therefore, carbon dioxide is accumulating in the atmosphere, predominantly from fossil fuels, but not exclusively. This slide shows you the increase in greenhouse gases from a wide variety of sources, from fossil fuels, especially carbon dioxide, but also increases of methane from rice production, escaping from oil and gas fields, nitrous oxide, largely from the agricultural sector, but also fluorinated gases. But when we deforest our land, we also see increases in carbon dioxide as well. So quite clearly, the Earth cannot absorb all of these gases, and the changes really are quite rapid. The conclusion clearly is, and based on good observation, that the world has already warmed 1 degree or more in the last century. We're seeing sea level rise, which is actually accelerating in rate, and we are seeing more frequent, intense extreme events, floods, droughts, wildfires. All of these threaten nature, and all of these threaten human well-being. The next slide moves on to talk about why are we seeing a loss of biodiversity? Well, what we see on this particular slide is what are the major direct drivers of changes in terrestrial ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems, and marine ecosystems. With respect to terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, the main driver is land use change. Sea use change is also a major driver in the marine systems. That's in purple. But we also have direct exploitation, a key issue not only in terrestrial and freshwater systems, but the dominant driver in the marine systems, overfishing in particular. In yellow, you see climate change, green pollution, and in blue, invasive alien species. Now, while climate change has not been the dominant driver of changes in biodiversity to date, if we don't achieve the Paris targets of limiting climate change to less than 2 degrees Celsius and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100, climate change could well be the dominant factor affecting biodiversity in the future. As you already heard from Inga, 1 million of the world's estimated 8 million plants and animals are threatened with extinction. If we act now, we can save most of them, but they are threatened. We're seeing the population sizes and the abundances of species dropping quite dramatically. Ecosystems are being degraded and our ecosystem services are being eroded. We're increasing the production of food, fiber, the provisioning services from nature, but at the expense of the regulating services, the way nature helps to control climate, air pollution, water pollution, pests and diseases. So there's no question, as we lose biodiversity, we are seriously impacting on human well-being. Half the warm water corals, for example, have already disappeared. And if we have a warming of 2 degrees Celsius, which we're clearly on the pathway to, less than 1% of warm water corals are likely to survive. So quite clearly, we have a serious threat to nature at the moment. The next slide is a key one. What this simply says is we can no longer view climate change, loss of biodiversity, pollution, land degradation as separate issues. They are all intertwined. Climate change affects land degradation. It affects biodiversity, as I've already mentioned. In turn, climate change is affected by the loss of biodiversity. It is affected by land degradation. It is affected by pollution. So the bottom line of this is, and all, of course, affect human well-being. So while indeed issues such as climate change, land degradation, biodiversity are considered to be environmental issues, they are also development issues, economic issues, social, security, moral and ethical issues, and they must be looked at together. We have an opportunity in the upcoming COPs, the ones on climate change, COP26, biodiversity, COP15, the upcoming meetings on land degradation. We need harmonized goals, targets, and actions. The time is now to bring these together, and also, as you'll hear later, with the Sustainable Development Goals. So clearly we have clear evidence that we are witnessing global environmental change. But let me turn back to Eva. Many people are convinced that society can live with some level of change. And the question is, who defines what change is acceptable, what change is unacceptable? Many people, for example, in cold climates like you, or where I grew up in England, would love a warmer climate. So do we really care about a changing climate? Do we really need all of these species?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Yeah, I'll actually come back to the latter part, but on the first one, you already alluded to it. The international community has agreed on the limits by setting environmental targets informed by science. And what we're doing now is that we're going beyond all these limits that we have already agreed to, despite some progress. So society is not on course to fulfill the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. At the current rate, warming will reach 1.5 by around 2040 and possibly earlier. Taken together, current national policies to reduce the emissions put the world on a pathway of warming to at least 3 degrees by 2100. But this may hopefully change with renewed pledges. Turning to biodiversity, to independent analysis, the CBD's GBO5 and the IPBES global assessment, both show that none of the achieved targets have been fully met. The world has been made progress on some elements, as shown in green on this slide, and in blue, but progress on most elements are insufficient or lacking, as shown in yellow and red, and in some cases actually even going backwards, as shown in purple. So these agreed international goals are regularly updated as they expired, as is the case for the Aichi targets. As you said, Bob, and now is an opportunity actually to renew the pledges both here and on the climate change. But let me actually turn to the next slide and try to sort of answer why we should not listen to people like me who would like to live in a warmer climate. This burning embers diagram, which is actually taken from the journal Science, an article there, shows the assessed risk associated with climate change, and risks increases from yellow via red to purple. Each of these 5 panels on this slide cover different natural and human systems. Panel A covers unique and threatened natural human systems. B is extreme weather events. C is vulnerability of developing countries, amongst others. D is the aggregate ecological and economic impacts, and E are the large scale changes, such as changes in ocean currents, for example. Now, the bars in each panel indicates the 4 latest IPCC reports, starting with the one that you chaired, Bob, which is the oldest one on this screen on the left-hand side, and the most recent ones to the right. And the dotted lines there show how risks of climate change are considered more severe now than previously thought some 20 years ago. So risks are occurring with smaller changes in temperature than previously thought, actually. So climate change, together with other factors, poses a significant risk to nature and people, and that's why we should worry about also loss of species. Let me turn to the next slide and show you this. Basically how environmental degradation now threatens also the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Indeed, human well-being goals in the upper ring here rests on the production and consumption goals in the middle ring, which in turn is based on the goals related to nature. The version of the diagram, which is actually also sometimes referred to as the wedding cake, is adapted from the GEO report. So environmental changes are undermining hard-won development gains by causing economic costs and millions of premature deaths annually. It is impeding progress towards ending poverty and hunger, reducing inequalities, and promoting sustainable economic growth, work for all, and peaceful and inclusive societies. Only in 2018, damages from climate-related natural disasters cost about $155 billion US. An eroding web of life means trouble. I mean, worldwide, 3.2 billion people are adversely affected by land degradation. The loss of animal pollinators, for instance, critical to more than 75% of food crops, including many fruit and vegetables, cash crops such as coffee, coke, and almonds, threatens annual global crop production between 235 billion and 577 billion US. Pollution still causes about 9 million premature deaths annually, primarily from indoor or outdoor air pollution. So if I can have the next slide, please. Basically, what the situation we're facing here is certainly that we are way behind on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, Bob, why is it so difficult? And is the SDGs, are the SDGs yet another set of international goals that are destined to fail to meet as vested interests take precedence? And if we are struggling, would it not, society then, should we not really rather focus on the immediate priorities such as poverty alleviation, food and water security, good health and good jobs for all?
Well, it's quite clear we are failing to meet the goals that we have set for ourselves. However, as you pointed out, we are making some progress. We are limiting to some degree the emissions of greenhouse gases. We are protecting, conserving and restoring some levels of biodiversity, but not to the levels that we need. We have not achieved these goals because we haven't looked at the root causes of these goals. And this is what we need to look at. We are clearly going to have to transform our relationship with nature. That's going to be the key to a sustainable future. We're going to have to rely on human knowledge, ingenuity, technology, and cooperation. All of these can indeed assist us to transform both society and economies for a sustainable future. We're going to need a fundamental change in the technological, economic, and social organization of society. We're going to have to relook at our worldviews, our norms, our values, our governance. What constitutes a good quality of life? We have to think about this. We will absolutely need major shifts in investments and regulations. They're absolutely key to a just and informed transformation that can indeed overcome inertia and opposition from vested interests. The next slide comes back to something you showed right at the very beginning. Now what we need to focus on is indeed the right-hand side of this graph. How do we move forward, basically? We need sustainable economic and financial systems. There is no question. We've got to transform these systems. We've got to start to use natural capital in our decision making. You mentioned this already. We need to use inclusive wealth that brings together natural capital with built capital, social capital, and human capital. We need to eliminate perverse subsidies in agriculture, mining, energy, and transportation. And we can realign some of these subsidies to more sustainable financing activities. We need to incorporate the environmental and social costs, the externalities into the prices of goods and services. We need to embrace a circular economy. So it is quite clear that we need to transform our economic and financial systems. Agriculture has some $700–800 billion of years in subsidies that adversely affect the environment. If you include the externalities, fossil fuel subsidies, as assessed by the IMF, could be as much as $5 trillion a year. Most of these are indirect, but some of them are still direct subsidies. So, Joyita, what should our main priorities be now?
So, Bob, I think the first most important priority is to close the greenhouse gas emissions gap. If we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, with a probability of about 50%, net emissions of carbon dioxide will need to be reduced by 45% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels, and we need to reach net zero by 2050. If you want to limit global warming to 2 degrees centigrade, then emissions need to decline by about 25% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels and reach net zero by around 2070. The emissions of other greenhouse gases must also be reduced. But as we've already demonstrated, 1.5 is probably a better goal if you want to address the broader issues of land degradation and biodiversity loss, as well as the risks to development. And of course, more ambitious reductions will be necessary for a higher certainty in limiting dangerous climate change, as indicated in the emissions gaps presented in this figure adapted from UNEP's emissions gap report. It shows various pathways with about 66% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2 degrees centigrade. If we move to the next slide, what we can see is that the loss of biodiversity can only be halted and reversed by providing space dedicated for nature, while also addressing drivers such as changing land and sea use, overexploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. Protected areas worldwide now cover more than 14% of land and almost 6% of the ocean. And one can only bend the curve by addressing the drivers of environmental degradation, such as climate change, land and sea use change, overexploitation, pollution, and invasive alien species. If we can achieve sustainable production and consumption, as this figure adapted from the Global Biodiversity Outlook shows. Ultimately, nature-based solutions have been estimated to provide between 35% and 40% of the mitigation effort needed until 2030 to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade. Moving to the next slide, what we can see is that around 75% of all new infectious diseases have their origin in animals. And about 700,000 potential viruses in animals and birds can still pose a threat to human health in the future. The risks of future zoonotic pandemics could be reduced drastically by managing human activities and applying a holistic One Health approach. The pandemic and the ensuing economic upheaval have shown the dangers of ecosystem degradation, as well as the need for uninterrupted international cooperation and greater social and economic resilience. This crisis, which is not yet over, has had major economic costs and is triggering significant investments. Ensuring that these investments support transformative change is key to attaining sustainability. And what is clear is that the world needs to tackle the environmental crisis in a coherent manner. But Ivar, how can the world, which is actually polycentric, with lots of partly interacting, partly autonomous decision-making entities, how can it actually address these big problems? How on earth can UN agencies and governments get everybody on board?
Well, Joita, that is the key questions for sure. Let's have a look at the next slide, maybe. I think the first thing is that we need everyone to sign up for a common vision. And we need to ensure that everyone has a part to play in driving that and achieving that vision. So we've tried to sort of home in on three main things here. One is really that we need to address the environmental emergencies and human well-being together. We need to transform the economic and financial system so that they can lead and power the shift to sustainability. And we need to transform the food, water, energy, and all the productive systems so that they meet the growing human needs in an equitable, resilient, and sustainable manner. Now, report then also identifies a number of actions that each actor can take. Do not have time to go into all that, but in general, I'll come back to governments and international organizations in a separate slide, but financial organizations, they can help direct investments, private sector innovates and implements, non-governmental organizations conceive ideas and raise awareness, and the executive director already spoke about all the things that we as individuals, households, civil society can then do in terms of putting theory into practice. The scientific and educational organizations are key to help improve our knowledge and understanding, and this report hopefully is actually a point in case. Let's just have a quick look at what governments can do, some takeaway messages here. Well, I think the key is that the governments need to lead the change, and that has to be a cross-sectoral effort. So we're trying to pinpoint that, and key to that cross-sectoral effort is actually to transform the economic and financial systems so that they lead and power the shift needed. That's about accounting for natural capital. That's about establishing carbon taxes, carbon pricing, markets for carbon trading, schemes for offsetting of nature, payments for ecosystem services. And it's like Bob talked about, shifting the environmental harmful subsidies and investments in economic activities, research and development, and shift them towards low carbon and nature-friendly solutions. Same goes for transformation of the food and energy and production systems. Let's turn to international organizations. Well, yes, it is in many ways some of the same message. So international cooperation needs to be facilitated, doesn't come by itself. We need really strong and ambitious coalitions. I think the international community can really help develop the frameworks to facilitate the transformation of economic and financial systems. It's developing approaches to how to actually implement carbon taxes and pricing. It's supporting cooperation on shifting environmentally harmful subsidies. It's about working with other across the aisle and silos in the UN system, such as through the environmental management group on facilitating the transformation also of food, energy, and production systems. So there's a huge agenda before us, and perhaps if I could turn to the final slide. There are some quite a bit of resources actually also available on the Peace with Nature, and they are available through this link. But there are some huge challenges, and I'd like to sort of pass the torch on to Maria Jesus also for some observations from her side on sort of how we address the challenges that we've painted here now. Thank you.
Hello. Well, first of all, many thanks for inviting me to be here today. I give my thoughts after this great dialogue. Actually, for me, it was an honor to collaborate as researcher on this report, great report. As Jurita said at the beginning, there's clearly nothing new on the core of what is being said today, even though the effort of synthesizing science and making it more accessible is evident. The report is still high level and at times hard to translate into practical actions for every actor. Ivar just recognized that every actor has a role to play, every actor is key, and this is definitely a challenge looking forward, how to encourage action from all actors. UNEP and UN agencies definitely have a role to play in this sense. And then when we think of governments, even though we see some of them like listening to these scientific recommendations and coming up with new plans which actually offer guidance, how do we ensure to move from this guidance to actual change? We definitely need to involve people. You need to involve like local communities, everyone. And that is a definitely hard task. How to meaningfully engage them in sustainable policies, in national plans. I guess that to be engaged, they need to understand the challenges that they face, that we face. They need to see the benefits of making changes. They need to feel included in these plans and that this is not just simply imposed to them. So clearly, yeah, we have a hard work of communication and capacity building looking forward. And this is how I see it. Like, in short, we have like these three groups that need to work together. We have the scientific communities, international organizations that are working really, really hard to do the research and communicate it in the most practical way. Then we have governments grabbing these recommendations to put together and implement plans. But you also need the people to implement these plans. Communities need to understand and feel these plans are actionable and not just blah, blah, blah. I have seen great plans, great efforts, but people don't relate, so implementation fails. So you need people that understand them and that they have the energy to truly implement them. And this is where youth comes in, definitely. Youth has energy, youth has creativity, youth has so many tools. I know that sometimes this might sound a bit cliche, but it is true. We need the youth. It is a crucial actor, social actor in this transformation, but they need to be involved since day one to understand the challenges and the possible ways forward. And to be involved since day one, it's not only just making them participate in policymaking, which is also great, don't get me wrong, but real involvement starts before. It means having the opportunity to learn about all these issues from a young age. It starts with education for all, an education that touches deep into sustainable development issues, alternative livelihoods, circular economy, green jobs. To include youth in a truly meaningful way, governments and institutions have this challenge of mainstreaming sustainable education, mainstreaming climate change language. We saw in the Geo for Youth report that most youth don't really know what CDGs are, what inclusive wealth is. So how can we include them if they don't even know what this is? So for me, like for youth, it is really not only about giving us a space in decision-making table, but it is about capacity building, about raising awareness and good free education for all. So yeah, I think that is a great step to meaningfully engage communities, starting with the youth or even before, start with the children, and they will go spread the word and the energy to their communities and supporting the implementation and these changes that are needed. So to wrap up, yes, from my experience, personal experience on working with like governments or NGOs, develop plans and doing lots of stakeholder consultations to develop these plans, the message I want to share about all this information, I think that the need of capacity building since a young age. They need to raise awareness and the need of education for everyone to understand the challenges and the language that is being used here. So thank you and congratulations for this great report. So
thank you very much, Maria Jesus, and thank you everyone for these very insightful dialogue and reflection. We would now like to start the Q&A session. So please remember to submit any questions in the Q&A chat box or in the YouTube chat box. So we already have a few coming in. I'd like to start with this one for Ivar from Jared Boisier with the Nairobi Convention. He congratulates the report for the clear message that urgent, robust, large-scale, and coordinated response is necessary. He asks, what about Earth's biocapacity to continue to provide services and bounce back from degradation? Please go ahead, Ivar.
Yeah, I was just trying to find the question in the chat here, but anyway, no, I think that this our real problem here is that we are both destroying and overshooting the Earth's capacity to sustain human well-being. And very clearly, we need to really hurry up to restore that capacity and to adapt to that level of capacity. And I think that that's a huge challenge for society. And obviously, in this requires an enormous amount of ingenuity and cooperation across many different fields and walks of life. And I simply cannot see how this is possible without the UN and the governments taking a lead. But obviously, it would have to involve all of us, it's not possible to mobilize, for instance, all the resources needed without also mobilizing the private sector and private sector resources, and none of this will happen unless we all sort of join hands. I think we in the report are quite optimistic that it's possible, but it would really require us to transform society to a huge extent, actually.
Thank you, Ivar. Any other reflections from the rest of our panelists? Okay, let's move on then. We have another question from my colleague Bridget in the Science Division. She asks, Bob, you have recently contributed to a thought-provoking article on net zero emissions. Can you tell us what you think about all these pledges being made by countries or businesses to reach net zero by a certain date?
Yes, I was a co-author on a quite controversial paper saying that net zero is a dangerous concept. What I mean by that, and what we meant by that in our paper, is that people have actually focused on net zero emissions by 2050 rather than focusing on immediate short-term reductions in greenhouse gases now, as our presentation showed. If we want to be on a pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. If we want to be on a 2-degree pathway, we have to reduce our emissions by 25% by 2030. The trouble is that many governments around the world have not been focusing on the short-term emissions reduction, but sort of making pledges that effectively by 2050, the middle of the century, there'll be net zero. But what they're relying on, by not taking short-term measures, they're relying on negative emission technologies in the middle of the century. We argued in our paper, this is foolhardy. There are real concerns about the environmental, economic, and social implications of most of these negative emission technology. Large-scale bioenergy, with or without carbon capture and storage, could potentially adversely affect biodiversity if monoculture plantations replace natural ecosystems, forests, grasslands. Large-scale afforestation could equally have adverse effects on water resources. And if indeed any of these activities encroach on arable land, then clearly food and water security is threatened. So yes, we do need net zero emissions in 2050 or thereabouts. But the key is we need short-term emission reduction. And we've been seduced into the concept of net zero at the expense of short-term emissions, too much reliance on unproven technologies. So the pledges that came out last week in the Biden summit is superb. Europe going over 65, almost 70% reductions by 2030. The UK 78% reductions by 2035. The US saying up to 52% reductions by 2050, by 2030, and others. However, almost in no case did the government say how they're going to achieve those transitions. How will they actually move away from fossil fuels in the production of energy? How will they improve end-use efficiency? How will we stop degrading our land so we reduce the emissions from land, from agriculture, from forestry? So I'm extremely pleased to see these pledges. Obviously, they would give us far more chance to be on the pathway for the Paris targets, but we need all countries. It isn't just Europe, America. It is also China, India, Brazil, where deforestation is at almost an all-time high. So we need all countries to work together. And as our own document said, all countries working together with the private sector. So yes, the pledges last week were a step in the right direction. I need to see what the technologies, policies and practices are that would actually allow for those pledges to be met.
Thank you, Bob. That's very enlightening. And does anyone else have anything to add from the panelists? Yes, Inger, please go ahead.
Of course, Bob, I have to understand that I will have to come in on this one because this article is quite path-breaking, and it does question, it does pose a lot of very helpful questions. But working in the policy space, and these are questions that many of us, yourself included, have posed for a long time. Can we really, in the IPCC numbers, include and take account for future technologies when those technologies don't really exist today? And yet we have felt that that was, we, meaning the big global we, the multilateral we, including science, have kind of gone along with it, with the understanding that, you know, yes, if we make these, then we can reach 1.5, etc. I think what we, from the UN side and from everyone's side, and yesterday I was pleased to have a meeting with Alok Sharma, the incoming president of COP26. The primary point that we are making now is get ambition with timeline in your NDCs that you're going to put into Glasgow, because that's a, you know, you can actually do a gap report on the basis of that. You can get real numbers out of that. You can see whether it's not, if it's done or not, whether it's hot air or whether it's real. So I very much agree with you on what you've said, that it's easy to say on January 1 that I'm going to run a marathon in December, but you actually have to start training on January 2 and 3 and 4. And it's the same with the net zero promises, that it's easy to say by 2050, but the verification is, so what does your NDC say? So I guess the message that we are putting out there right now as UNEP and as the UN and with the Secretary General is, yeah, these are lofty promises. We are going to look in the NDCs, which are nationally determined, so they're not top down. They are not what was what was controversial. But what we also agreed in Paris is, of course, that we will submit these every 5 years, folks, and every 5 years we're going to stretch. So that's sort of, it's not undercutting your point, but it's adding to your point, yeah, that we need to get those NDCs. They must be ambitious, they must stretch. And the science that we had back in the day when we first agreed to the UNFCCC and Kyoto was just not as precise as it is today. And now we know, as we saw by the burning embers that Ivor showed, that in fact, 1.5 is quite serious and will have significant impacts across a number of Earth systems dimensions. So I just wanted to add that point. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Inger. And actually, this next question was submitted in advance for you. It asks, how is UNEP stepping up its engagement with the UN system and with member states to help achieve the necessary transformation described in the report?
Well, I think so. There are a number of ways, and this would be something that member state representatives who might be present here would be really interested in, that we are engaging. First of all, I think it's fair to say that never before has UNEP been as front and center with the sort of core UN bodies in terms of the rest of the UN system. The Secretary General has taken the issue of biodiversity, the issue of climate change, as well as the issue of pollution and overall sustainable consumption and production very, very much as part of his platform and agenda. And you will see that in UNGA 75, when he was asked to come up by UNGA 76 with our common agenda, which is supposed to be sort of a blueprint for what needs to happen ahead, and it's on peace and security as well, and economics and finance. But you will see, and he will release this, I think, early May, after intensive conversations with member states, etc., that in fact, this sort of UNEP topics, the sustainability topics, which of course is everybody's topics, don't get me wrong, feature very large in that draft of the common agenda. Secondly, there is something called the Environmental Management Group, which was established by an UNGA resolution. It is made up of 51 UN agencies and entities. I chair that, and it enables us to take topics and then deal with them in a system-wide manner. This year, I should say last year, the focus was on biodiversity, and we have worked that through the Environmental Management Group. In addition, we've worked this through the Secretary General's board, where we have now got a common approach to biodiversity, and that's the first time ever. So whether it's UNICEF or WHO or any agency, there are 36 agencies that are part of the common approach to biodiversity. That plan will now, I will be presenting it to my colleagues and the Secretary General 3rd of May, I think. And so that will then be, okay, so we've got that in place. So now we have climate change in place. We all know that, but we will also have biodiversity in place. And next up, of course, is pollution. So, you know, each of these we're really pushing very much ahead. And last point I will say, with the COPs that you referenced, Bob, and we have seen just yesterday, well, just how unfortunately, the desertification COP has been postponed, but till 2022, an unspecified date, but nevertheless, in view of the complexities. But nevertheless, these COPs that are coming up, and I urge all member states to continue to work in the virtual format because the planet does not stop. So let's find a way of making that work, closer brackets, but with these COPs, as well as with the Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, really UNEP is pushing these issues in with member states, with the rest of the UN system. UNDP is a big ally, FAO is a big ally, WHO, UNICEF, etc., are very strong movers of these agendas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Inger. Any reflections from the rest of our panelists?
Only
All
to
right.
say that the role of the UN system is absolutely crucial. And it's good to see that we're going more and more a joined up UN system. This is absolutely crucial. It's the same that within individual governments, we need joined up governments. Departments of energy need to work together with environment, agriculture, finance, infrastructure, etc. So the only way to address any of these issues is to have joined up governments at the national level and at the international level. So clearly a very, very good intervention.
I also would like to add something, because in all the reports that have come out recently, there's a strong focus on the need to change the way we look at the economy and how we calculate our GDP, and maybe that we need to move towards inclusive wealth. Now, all this basically implies a transition from how governments at the current moment look at the way they design their economy, whether it's in the global north or in the global south. I see that some people are listening, but I don't see yet a change in the way policies are being made, either in the big UN agencies or in national governments. So how do we operationalize this idea of changing the way we calculate economic growth for countries? I mean, if we call a country least developed economy because it doesn't have a certain GDP, we're already looking at countries and ranking them in terms of their GDP. Whereas what we are saying right now is we have to get rid of the GDP concept, to think about inclusive wealth, and maybe, who knows, maybe a least developed economy actually has a fantastic inclusive wealth results, you know? So we have to figure this out, and this is, I think, a big challenge, because if I'm going to tell my developing country colleagues and friends, no more GDP for you guys, it's degrowth or whatever, you know, we have to revisit, I will lose my audience. So we have to find a way of explaining this narrative in a communicable manner to people and countries.
Thank you, Joyita. And actually, the next question I'd like to ask, I think, raises a similar concern of communicating to various stakeholders. Habib with UN Habitat asks, how can we make environmental issues a concern for various stakeholders in a context of ongoing conflict or post-conflict countries? Joyita, could you perhaps have a response first, and then maybe the rest of our panelists?
So, you know, whether you are in a post-conflict country or you're suffering from COVID-19, environment sort of gets pushed to the background because everybody's firefighting to address the issue that's on the table today. But for any long-term solution to preempting, whether it's a pandemic or an economic crisis or a conflict, the only way to do that is also to address the role of the environment in exacerbating conflict, in exacerbating pandemics, in exacerbating stress between users and users of, for example, water. So ultimately, the long-term approach has to be integrated also in the short-term approach. And that is going to be the big challenge. My gut feeling says that whether you are in a conflict situation or you are in a pandemic situation, you need to ensure that your recovery plans, your building back better narrative is not really focused on building back, but building better and changing your storyline so that we don't create the same mistakes that we had before. It's a tall order for countries that don't have the resources. I mean, in the West, even though we do have the resources and we are trying to deal with the pandemic, we still somehow are also reinvesting in the airline industry, in the tourism industry, which have a very big environmental footprint. But in the developing countries, it's even more complicated because their resources are much more limited. So I think that's a really big issue. And in all this, one of the things that we didn't discuss in any of the reports, but which is coming up very strongly in the development studies narrative, is the fear that developing countries will run into massive economic debt in the coming years to come, because they're borrowing money for infrastructure, for dealing with disease, for dealing with all kinds of things. How will they pay back?
Thank you, Joyita. Does anyone else have anything to add from the panel?
I could add something there. I think it was a really interesting question, this one on conflict. As recently I was doing some research on Southeast Asia on youth, and we were asking like what were the main concerns to see if climate change or environmental issues arose. And in some countries that was one of the biggest concerns, or maybe like jobs or employment. But there was this one country that it was also like conflict. And with the researchers, we started thinking like, it's hard to communicate to them like these environmental issues and environmental concerns when they are living in a conflict or post-conflict situation. It's clearly understandable that they won't relate that much. But I really feel and support what Joyita was saying, that the way I see it is try to help them understand this thing of building better and not building back better. that in a way they have this chance to make things different now. They need to feed all these people after this conflict. They need to have new living places. I don't know. So they have a chance here to create new system and build in a different way than what they had before. So I think that's the message that I would try at least to take to these places they have conflict or post-conflict.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria Jesus. Oh yes, go ahead, Ivar, please.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important question actually, and it's kind of the fact that a number of countries are facing internal conflicts, and there are conflicts still around the world. It's clearly sets the sort of immediate priorities and trying to solve those conflicts. But I think in the report we also point to the fact that conflict over resources, environmental degradation also can create conflicts. And I guess that is also why they partly why the Secretary General has called for us to make peace with nature. So in many ways, we need this sort of long-term approach whereby we create the foundation for a transition to sustainability, and then we need to sort of go a little bit beyond the immediate sort of crisis that we are seeing as part of the pandemic, for instance. And I think there is also perhaps where the UN system can come in and help a lot, because one is a little bit above some of the sort of day-to-day challenges within a nation, some of the day-to-day trade-offs between the different sectors. I saw during my own time in the environment management group that I felt it was actually easier to work across the sectors in the UN system than it was when I was working at the national level. So I think the UN can actually help sort of develop this common vision that we all need to align behind if we are going to transform to a net zero emission society by 2050, if we're going to restore biodiversity, if we're going to curb pollution. So I think the UN has a really central role to play in this transformation.
Thank you, Ivar. And certainly another big part of the transformation will be paying attention to the economic systems that we currently have in place. And that relates to our next question, which Boris, who is a sustainable lifestyles and education consultant with UNEP, asks, governments need to lead the change, as mentioned by Ivar, but they won't be able to do it unless first, reduced consumption is embraced by the electorate, and second, religion of economic growth changes. How do we get there? Any reflections, perhaps? Yes, please, Ingrid.
I mean, look, I think the religion of growth, it's too simple. We can't just say it. It's easy to say, very difficult to do. So let's just understand that today, the systems we have and the systems changes we are calling for, we sort of need to work within the confines of that. And so the kind of things that Jyoti said, I think that's where we need to start. We need to start with understanding that the way we have assumed we have wealth just doesn't compute anymore, because we can't take out of nature and assume that nature will still be there for us. We can't take out of the earth systems and assume that the earth system will still deliver for us. This idea that we take stuff out and it will regenerate, well, and that we can just sort of take stuff out of nature, put it into the economy, make growth an opportunity, and when we're done with it, we discard it back into nature. Well, I mean, it sort of worked. I put that in inverted commas when we were a few people on this earth and we could put it away, we didn't see it. But it just doesn't work anymore. So this paradigm is debunked. And I think the good news is, if I can say so, that more and more people are realizing that. I agree with Jyoti that it is slow. And that, but finally in the Statistical Commission of the United Nations, we got this breakthrough. So, we say, yes, after goodness knows how many years. I was at the World Bank when we began to talk about inclusive wealth accounting and valuation of ecosystem services. It's 15 years ago, I don't know, 20 years ago. Could we get national treasuries to do this? Could we get ministries of finance to do this? No, we could not. So it is not just the UN that can with a magic wand wave and say, now thou shall, in the way you measure your national wealth, do it this way. It is voters, it is voices. And this is why I like what Maria said, because it is about making your voice known, understanding, as the Dasgupta review highlighted for us, Sapatha Dasgupta review highlighted, that nature is an asset. And no, that doesn't mean we're putting dollar signs on trees, but it means that we understand that as we erode nature, we are impoverishing ourselves. So I think it's this kind of issue. And finally, maybe just on the question of countries in conflict, many times you can put a map of environmental degradation, erosion, heavy climatic impact across a swath of the earth. And you will see that where that is happening, that is also where conflict is finding root. And this is not rocket science. If the nature cannot deliver for you, for your family, well, either you're gonna provide for your family, or societal disintegration sets in. And it's easier then for negative forces to abuse that for own gain, whether it's be a mafiaization, if there is such a word, of criminality, etc., or whether it be other forces. So I think we need to understand that wedding cake that we saw, the very foundational elements of nature, of the planet, of a reliable climate, of the sense that season will follow season, that we cannot mess with to the extent that we pull the rug from under nature's feet and under the planet's feet. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Inger. So next we have a question from my colleague Ying, also from the Science Division. She says, great report and presentation. How do you see the three Rio conventions working together to a joint effort? How can we increase the coherence and synergy among multilateral international conventions at large? Would anyone like to go first for this one? Bob, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. It's clear the secretariats of the conventions are working together. They meet regularly. They understand the connections between the various secretariats. The challenge is to get governments to recognize the interconnections. At this moment in time, especially large governments, they send totally separate delegations to the climate negotiations, the biodiversity negotiations, the chemicals, the land degradation. So the first challenge, and I'm hoping this is, that governments have to internally start to work together, that when they come up with a position for climate, biodiversity, or land degradation, or chemicals, they realize they need to put an interdepartmental strategy together so that when they go to the different conventions, they will have a cohesive story. So I don't think the problems with the conventions and the secretariats. I think this is a responsibility of the governments to start to link these issues. And so when they go, they will recognize what the potential synergies are from one agreement to another. And they'll also recognize what some of the potential unintended consequences could be. So I would put this as a major challenge to governments rather than a major challenge to the conventions and the secretariats.
Perhaps
Okay,
if I could add, maybe I think it's really at several levels at the same time. So obviously, I mean, the secretariats need to talk together, and I think to a large extent they do. And within governments, there is need for much better dialogue as well. But I also think one might want to think a little about how the intergovernmental processes interact. And I think there, obviously, the UN Environment Assembly is the one that is meant to look at the totality of the environmental challenges. And it's about, it's how the Assembly also interacts with the COPs of the conventions, and how the COPs also interact amongst themselves. So perhaps that is also something to give a little bit more thought to. And lastly, it's about interacting science. It's about how to make sure that the assessments actually complement each other, talk to each other. And I think there is also a little bit of potential there.
Thank you, Ivar. Yes, so our next question also relates to action. It's asking, or it states first, it is important and very useful to have reports like Making Peace with Nature. But if this is not accompanied by a practical and easy to use influence plan, then it just remains a report that may not be acted on. Is there some sort of influence plan that accompanies this important report that can guide stakeholders to drive the effort from evidence to influence and get meaningful action? So, who would like to take this one? A bit tricky.
Happy to do it, but I can also wait. I'm talking too much as it is. All right, so let me just, I mean, look, the plan, of course, and I very much agree with what Ivar just said. Look, the bigger plan is, of course, in the context of environment, it is within UNEP, it is within UNIA, that is where resolutions are made, that is where broader, beyond conventions, multilateral decisions are taken pertaining to the environment. And that's a very important forum that the UN has established, and that member states have established, under the United Nations auspices. But we need to understand that however important I obviously think environment ministers are, it is very important that it also folds into agriculture ministers. It is very important that industry gets this, that infrastructure gets this, that finance gets this. Because when we saw what Bob and Joetta and Ivar were presenting, they were talking also implicitly about the drivers of loss, the drivers of climate change, the drivers of pollution. And they're not driving within the environment ministries, or within the environment sectors. They're driving from industry, from finance, from agriculture. But we all need to eat. We all need a roof over our head. We all need heating and cooling. So we can't blame those sectors, but that is why the NDCs and that transformational processes that countries are making matter. And that is why it is not enough to have the conversation in UNIA. We need to have it when finance ministers meet. We need to have it when agriculture ministers meet, etc. And that's where the joined up UN system also provides that platform to enable that. I was very pleased that last year was a COVID year. 2019 was still a COVID year, but you know what I mean. When FAO passed the eco-agriculture, the biodiversity and agriculture policy, because it sort of drives an understanding that agriculture has a very important role to play in agriculture, in biodiversity conservation, and because it's biodiversity in working landscapes. So I think that's the kind of dimension that we just need to be mindful of, not to diminish in any way, shape or form the importance of UNIA, because UNIA sets the guardrails for what is acceptable for sustainability for the environment, but other sectors need to often be the ones taking the action.
Let me add something. I agree 100% with what Inga just said, of course. Finance ministers in particular are really crucially important, in my opinion. But obviously it is the role of the business sector. And I think there are some good signs. At the last couple of fora, the World Economic Forum, they have a risk register. And in the last 2 years, they have highlighted environment as the single biggest risk to the business sector. This year they added, of course, pandemics and COVID-like pandemics. But they also started to put some very nice documentation together about the role of biodiversity, the role of nature in the business, how important it is for business, what is the impact of business on biodiversity. They've recognized for some period of time now how climate change is an important issue. So I would think through the dialogue that's starting through the World Economic Forum and the World Business Council on Sustainability, I think we're starting to see at least the proactive, responsible parts of the business sector start to look at these issues quite seriously. So I am partially optimistic that with government recognizing how joined up these issues are and how some of the private sector recognize these issues, I think there is some hope in the future that it will at least move in the right direction. Whether we'll reach the sort of Paris targets, I think, is another question. But at least there is some hope that we have both business and government to complement the role of the NGOs and the public at large.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, Ivar.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question, actually, and great answers also from Inger and Bob. I just recall very vividly when we started this process, Inger, you challenged us. So you said you really wanted some crisp and clear language out of this report. I mean, I think one of the challenges, I've been working in the environmental field since the early 90s, and one of the challenges is that we sometimes get bogged down in very complex language and a very complex story in a way. And I think this, when we worked on this report, we were really challenged on the sort of how to present the story. We got a great science editor to work with us. And I think it was really a challenge for a number of us to sort of try to sort of get a bit beyond the usual sort of language. And I felt we sort of came some way at least, and perhaps that is also something one could build on further to sort of create a story which everyone can understand and relate to. And I think Maria talked about it, others have talked about it also, that is really what we need in order to align the whole world behind a new vision that's needed to transform both the economy, the private sector, the food sector, the energy sector, the industry sector, the way we consume and waste and throw away waste. Everything in a way needs to change. It needs to be much more resource efficient. It needs to be much more fair. The current model doesn't work anymore. I mean, as you said, Inger, we're sort of at the point where we clearly see that the earth can't provide us with the support we need if we continue on this path. So I think we need to somehow develop a clear and concise story to rally around.
Thank you, Ivar.
Just a bit on this,
go ahead.
just to wrap up, because everyone has provided some answer on this, because it's really, really interesting question. Definitely, it's sometimes I think people push a lot, like the UN or the scientific community, like come up with an influence plan, come up with this is what we need to do. But we also need to understand that if the UN or scientific community comes with this like very like little box, this is what we need to do, this step, this step, this step, this won't adapt to national realities or to regional, local realities. So we can provide, the scientific community can provide some broad recommendations, and there are lots of good recommendations and in a way guidance on these reports, particularly in this last one, that in a way governments or like in regional areas need to grab them and provide guidance that is more adaptable and understandable for the local realities, because there's no just one model that will be used and serve to each particular place. If we do that, we will fail again. So for me, that's very important. We can not expect the scientific community or the UN to have these like these are the steps, because that's not real, I guess.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria Jesus. So now we have one question or comment from the floor. Victor, who is the co-chair of the Youth Liaison for the upcoming Food Summit, he says, while looking at the triplet of challenges, climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, these are issues that especially jeopardize the futures of young people and children. So that's his comment. And then in follow-up to that, I have a question for you, Maria Jesus. You spoke about the need for meaningful engagement of stakeholders. Could you tell us a bit about your involvement as one of the young authors with UNEP? And then could you perhaps tell us a bit how you think meaningful engagement can become more commonplace?
Okay, yeah. In regarding to the last point, how engagement can become like more meaningful, it goes back to the point I raised, like for engagement to be meaningful, like people need to understand what is being spoken. We need to understand the language, we need to understand the risks and the opportunities. And I still don't see at high school, I still don't see at universities, I still don't see that it's mainstream environmental concerns, circular economy, inclusive wealth. So we cannot expect them, people working on finance or people working on the private sector, to be applying this idea because they don't learn them. I mean, maybe I learned them or people, other youth I work with, because we were really interested about the environment, maybe because of personal reasons. So we got deep into it, but that was not something mainstream, and I still don't see it. It's hard. Most of my friends probably won't understand about all these issues, and every time I try to explain like what I do or all these problems, I still need to start from step one. You know, I do feel that awareness is raising, but we still need to start like from like, since people are children, since kids from a young age, universities, this needs to be definitely mainstream. And this way people will be able to meaningfully engage because they will understand the challenges and make changes, you know, like if you understand like these challenges and then you see, okay, there's opportunities for green economy, circular economy, and this will not jeopardize the future of kids and youth if we understand this and like are able to make changes. And my engagement with UNEP, I think I was definitely very lucky. I'm super thankful. I do understand sometimes it is still hard for me. In my case, it's because I wanted to work in the environment. So I started looking for people that work there and just send emails, you know, and until I found my boss and he was like, you know, UN is looking for youth. You just need to apply, go there and make your voice heard. And that's what I did. So that's my recommendation for youth. Like people that are interested, like you need to look for other youth or other people that are working on this and ask and like join forces and build together. And there are opportunities out there, just like you need to go and look for them.
Thank you very much, Maria Jesus. That's some very good advice. And we have to close now. Thank you, everyone, very much. And I'd like to hand over to Inger for some closing remarks.
Oh, I was waving goodbye to everybody, but anyway, let me just say a big thanks. This has been absolutely fascinating. Obviously, we would much rather be in the room together. We would much rather hear voices directly from ambassadors and member states. We'd much rather have a direct interaction. But doing this, we actually had some very powerful voices that were part of the authoring team. My deep thanks to you, Bob, to you, Ivor, to you, Joetta, to you, Maria, and of course to you, who have been tirelessly supported this outreach effort. But most, of course, thanks to everyone who has attended, both via the YouTube streaming, as well as directly on this platform. I wish everybody to stay safe and healthy, and I look forward to talking next time as we work together, making peace with nature. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, thanks.
Bye, everybody.